It was after David encouraged himself in the Lord his God in verse 6 of this chapter that we once again read a very familiar phrase. David inquired at the Lord, verse 8. David is back in touch with God, and it was to have wonderful benefits for him, but also for all those around him. We're going to read about this from 1 Samuel chapter 30 and verses 17 to 20. And David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day, and there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men which rode upon camels and fled. And David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives, and there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. And David took all the flocks and the herds which they drove before those other cattle, and said, This is David's spoil. When David was with Achish, we noticed that he had behaved in a very careless and callous way. But once his heart was restored to fellowship with God, he became again the man that God would have him to be. It was actually because of kindness to an abandoned slave in verse 12 that David was able to locate the company that had ransacked and burned Ziklag. What I love to read in this passage are the words in verse 18. David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. And then again, David recovered all at the end of verse 19. Whenever David got back to God, he got everything back. Yes, it's true that he had lost time. It's true that he had made mistakes. He had been in places that he shouldn't have been. He had said things that he shouldn't have said. But he was genuinely sorry about those things. His restoration to God, therefore, was complete. As he wrote in Psalm 23 verse 3, he had understood of the Lord that He restoreth my soul. God was not keeping him at arm's length. When a believer repents and God restores that wandering believer, He restores him or her to full fellowship. Here's what John writes. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. 1 John chapter 1 verse 9. But David's restoration brought benefits to others too. As they pursued the Amalekites, we read about 200 of his men who abode behind, which were so faint that they could not go over the brook Besor. That's in verse 10. In the verses that follow, we learn that David ensured that they would share in the spoils of victory. As his part is that goeth down to the battle, so shall his part be that tarrieth by the stuff. They shall part alike. Verse 24. And at the end of the chapter we read that he sent of the spoil unto the elders of Judah a present. That's verse 26. David's restoration brought blessing to all of God's people. The wonderful thing about our God is that He can bring good results even out of evil actions. And the cross is perhaps the greatest demonstration of this truth. It does not excuse us for sinning, and it doesn't suggest that we should be careless about sin because God will bring good out of it. The pernicious idea, let us do evil that good may come, that Paul condemns in Romans chapter 3 verse 8. But it underlines that God can bring blessing no matter what. As Paul wrote, where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. Romans chapter 5 verse 20. We have a God who restores and who can restore all.